Hi, my name is Program Assistant participating in one of our. You know what's going on tonight already, but for this, for 9 weeks every summer, the Work Center hosts week-long open enrollment visual arts. Learning more, you can ask me or any of the staff on hand after this. If you're here longer than this week, you should think about taking one of our workshops. One of our favorite parts of our summer programs is that every week our world-class faculty mesmerize our audiences with presentations and talks. Tonight we're going to hear from 3 amazing members: writer Paul Lisicky, poet Major Jackson, and photographer and writer Joanne Dugan. Paul and Major will read from their work, and Joanne will make a presentation of her, and they'll then conduct a Q&A with the audience. So before we begin, a bit of housekeeping and some other items of interest. Books by all 3 speakers tonight will be for sale in our bookstore and at the and all faculty members who speak tonight will be signing their books at this table at the front of the room after the event. And books by other members of this year's faculty will also be for sale in our bookstore and at the back of the room, as well as some very pretty Falk merchandise out. The new Hudson D. Walker Gallery will be open after the event, and right now we're showing an exhibit called Density's Glitch, which features work by former Falk Fellows. The proceeds of all work sold will go to support Falk's program, so be sure to check it out after the event. And we'd also shout out to East End Books, who helped us stock and set up our bookstore. Restrooms are located down that hall. And finally, please turn your cell phones. We are beginning with Paul Ziki. Paul is a 2-time fellow here at the Work Center and has served on the writing committee, which selects the writing fellows for our 7-month winter residency since 2000. He's a long-time, beloved member of the Falk Summer faculty and is teaching a workshop this week called Workshop. Paul is the author of 6 books, including My Life at the Edge of the World, The Narrow Door. His work has appeared in The Atlantic, Conjunctions, The Cut, Fence, The New York Times, and his awards include fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the NEA. He's the MFA Program at Rutgers University-Camden, where he is associate professor and editor of StoryQuarterly. He lives in Brooklyn, and he recently completed his next book, The Inner Anton of Me. His readers recommend a unique glimpse into his life and experiences his writing provides, and the Los Angeles Times praised his memoir writing as exulting in lit with flashes of poignant spectacle. Furthermore, Magazine described later My Life at the Edge of the World as a vibrant, heartbreaking love in Provincetown, Massachusetts. So let's give a warm Falk welcome to Paul.
So much for being here. It's just such a faces of so many people who are dear to me. This space is dear to me, even though it's been radically reconfigured since the last. I mean, I'm just remembering that Peter and I read together in this space like literally 10 years ago, and there's something about figuring it that reawakens it. And glorious readings I was to hear over the years. Art, reading Ellen West, Lucy reading from the Masters. It's like glorious things have happened within these 4 walls, and yeah, the space feels, for lack of a better word, holy, and I'm really honored to be with you tonight. It was announced that my next book that I just finished, I did, but what happened in December was that I DM from an editor on Twitter and said, he said, Paul, would you ever be interested in writing a book on Joni Mitchell? And I casually said, sure. I didn't want to say that, like the improv, are you kidding? And he said, who's your agent? And my agent, he said, long story short, the next book is a book about Joan Mitchell in my life. And thanks. So that's make me very happy. I mean, my work knows that, and she's always in there. She's in the cracks and talking to me, and I'm talking back to her. So, a book that that was about her so much. I wrote a first synopsis that was focused on the album Hijira, and that wasn't what he wanted. Something more personal along the lines of two previous books. So I don't want to talk more about some pretty ruthless cuts of this. So bear with it if it doesn't always make sense. I wanted to make sure it fit within the time frame of 15 or so minutes. So excited to stage with my friends Major and Joanne tonight, and I'm looking forward to talking with both of you afterward. So, love, I gotta get a hold of myself. I'm scared shitless. Okay. I'm not sure if this is the opening or the ending. In 1965, a young woman from Saskatchewan held a new guitar across her lap, leaning into the shape of its body. The torn wood came up from the sound hole. Her fingers picked and strummed the song. Well, it must have felt satisfying to play an actual guitar, baritone ukulele. Something was off, something about her knuckles. She couldn't find the pressure to make a D major chord. Her left hand hadn't she'd wanted it to, not since it had polio at 9, when she'd had to stay in bed for weeks, lie perfectly still on her back to stop the disease's spread. She contorted her hand. She might have heard the voice of her mother who called her a quitter. The trick was to say a big no to the face that didn't want the best for her. Where was she when she reached for the tuning peg and twisted it beyond the expected direction? Joni says she learned to retune from Eric Anderson. He only suggested G tuning, already common among certain folk. She didn't stop there, nor did she stop when the higher strings snapped and flailed. One might have said, that's no way to play guitar. You're killing the neck. Right, she could play the left-hand shapes that suited her fingers. She could write songs that sounded orchestral, entirely her own, rewriting the rules of Western musical tradition. A cloud. The artist's task was to find a sound that captured how she talked, of her breath, how she held the glass in her hands as she walked from one side of the party to the other. Retuning her guitar, audacious as renaming the typewriter keys and adding some extra letters. Audacious as likening herself to Van Gogh and Picasso, which would come. Audacious as hiring the musicians and fighting them when need be. How many men did she? She was on her own in a world of men, straight men, who must have had arms over their chests, leaned back in their chairs, looked at her with mildly amused contempt when she said, "Tonight, runway dates, plane landing, hot tires and rubber, play that." The fourth string, the fifth string. When did she think the guitar had taken enough punishment? And those tunings down through the years, hitting the ears of people along a car, atop a skyscraper, in an underground, mad, though there had to be a better word for it. Sorcery? Hello out there, an astronaut, a drug dealer, a pilgrim. The wind blew through the open window. It didn't seem so bad that the Brooklyn trees were stripped of leaves, the light falling on the mold. And I were deep, more involved once it became clear that we were crazy about the same song. It would have been too on the nose to talk about Joni, though he must have considered it. Joni was fraught country. Joni was personal. As far as question, what if I was the kind of person who only listened to everything before 1970 reached her? What if I hated the jazz work, or else loved it too much, he'd done more albums in the vein, maybe with acoustic instruments rather than electronic? What if he believed there was such a thing as a single coherent Joni over time, and not a village of poets one another? What if I didn't know an open tuning from a corkscrew? What if the game was utter genius? I mean, I loved the imaginary campfire of Circle Game, but ponies and captive on carousels and cartwheels, I don't think so. It would be very easy to make an ending where there was a beginning. And besides, who didn't love Joni these days? I rarely ran into a person who didn't to being a Joni fan or saying my grandmother is a total Joni fan. It came with no risk of bad taste, no chance of sounding a little dim, whether you were straight, black, brown, old, young, and academic, someone who rung up blackberries and extension cords at the Dollar General on the edge of town. And Jude wrote me about P.J. Harvey, singer-songwriter, certainly someone of Joni's lineage, but one inevitably does about one's parents, especially a fair share of the room with their feelings. I'd posted a song Under Ether from White Chalk, and Jude wrote about PJ taking flack for her arrangements on the album, the piano being a previously unexplored instrument for her. I find the naivete adds to the haunted feeling of the music he wrote. The reviewer got it wrong. Quote from the piece itself, expected risk-averse ways, in that it elevated perfection over capturing the process of a song coming into being. There wasn't judgment in Jude. He wasn't shaking his fist. Rather, it was just melancholy. People couldn't see a wonder when it was looking right at him with an open face. His DM was more essay than casual. Essay, crafted, animated. It had nouns. There was no hint of power in its tone or assessment. Instead, it said, I'm going to show you the spirit, something that you don't know about music, and maybe you're going to show me what you know too. I didn't reply for days. This wasn't coolness. My heart wasn't hard. In fact, I could be annoyed by those who behaved as if one's gates was the inevitable consequence of being out of a long relationship. I wasn't tired, nor was I fully allergic to the cycle of hope, expectation, taming expectation to come down to smoke. But honestly, in 11 years of single life, I taught myself in increments, without being fully conscious of it, not to my energy to one person. No small thing for someone who happened to latch. I had many friends, deep friends, casual friends, friends who were more. I had a rich and various and often frenetic life. I could walk into a crowded room by myself and stand at the center, and I didn't even know if anybody came up to talk or not, but inevitably they did because it looked like I didn't need them. I'd built myself back up from scratch over the course of my decade, even though others had contributed switches and lumber. I told myself I wasn't lonely, it as many as 6 times a day. Why screw up such goodness? though at the same time I was astounded. I was walking Fort Street for the 5th time that afternoon, setting myself out on another pointless errand for a yellow key cover and miracle. That aside from my teaching, so much of my waking life was dependent on my eye, that I had put such effort into this eye, keeping this eye lighted with the adult versions of Play-Doh and tangerine chalk sticks. And I might have looked at the person sitting in the chair across. You need anything, babe? When I finally wrote him a more involved note on his birthday, I said, "You're so good at review." Singer-songwriters use amateurism or searching to their advantage. Actually talking about Joan's methodology, but wasn't ready to go there just yet, and let out a breath. Just thinking of the dulcimer songs on Blue. Joni was learning the dulcimer as she wrote those songs. The constraint made them. Later, he told me biking the mountains of North, biking the grass, Halloween. In the days to come, I found out he was a neurologist, physician, and writer. Found out he was a dedicated reader of Shelley, James Tate, and Lydia Davis. Found out that after years in California, he'd moved back to Louisiana months after the pandemic to be a doctor in his hometown on the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, just off the 18-mile bridge through the cypress swamp. But along with the exchange of our histories, I kept coming back to Joni as our orientation point. Her phrasing, her tunings, her guitar, her piano songs, her half-baked songs. It felt both transgressive and thrilling to talk about the in such a way that made our disappointment bring us into a deeper respect. As to our favorites, it surprised us and did that with few exceptions, we shared the same lot. Wolf that lives in Lindsay, down to you, let the wind carry me, same situation. Edith and a kingpin, rainy night. When we talked more specifically about relationships, the long ones we'd been through, he said he wanted to be sweet to me. At an earlier point in life, I might have found reason to be confused. Sweet. What other man knew himself well enough not just to want this, but to say it aloud? I looked at his FaceTime face, olive eyes, thick beard, soulful expression, which I thought of as the face of inquiry, physical representation of one of Joni's angry chords. Muscular arms. He looked like he could have come from the 17th century and out of one of the portraits of El Greco, but with a face of affection, curiosity, mischief, blazing intelligence, and light. I had no inclination to be get to know him, specifically him. He was me, and that scared me. It could have been Night Ride Home, the Magdalene Laundries, the Three Great Stimulants, Cactus Tree, any of the songs that are relatively straightforward, that moved like other. Instead, the first video he sent was Down to You, one of Joni's most demanding, a song she'd rarely done in concert, probably because it was too difficult to make all its independent moving parts sync up at once. He didn't perform it for me. That would come a bit later. Instead, in the span of a minute, he gave a little lecture about its architecture, which wasn't AABA like many popular songs, but A cadenza. So much went on in that cadenza, a morphing instrument as modalities, the bass note rarely as the root. It wasn't the most romantic song. If anything, it was the opposite in that its narrative consisted considered the inevitable loneliness that strangers, with people you might pick up in a bar after you've had drinks. He doesn't overplay that loneliness, so the phrase, "love's gone," punctures the listener. That loss is no longer just personal in the second verse of the song, but societal. A breakdown of connection, a collapse of kindness and warmth. Mary taken a collection of songs of freedom, especially sexual freedom. Tired, like me, of an ongoing pursuit that seemed significant once, after taught by the culture that his sex didn't exist, his body didn't exist, and if it did, his longing was depraved, a matter to be policed. Against that, what else was there but to look into one's gorgeousness and again? He knew I was a fan of songwriting, that I was a songwriter once, that I'd published music in my late teens and early 20s, that I once wanted to write work that approached the intimacy of Joni's music. He didn't yet know that I and drank that desire, that everything else was an obstacle to me. One day I stopped. Well, if it had been a day, I'd have been kinder to music and myself. A proper mourning could have occurred. I could have wrapped music inside a baby blanket, sent that basket down the river, as the voice inside went silent and the reeds. I'd come to think of my paragraphs as a sweet ghost writer for pulling in what I knew about phrasing, unexpected chordal leaps, shifts in meter, changes in emotional register, the silence between words. Every writer should begin with another art form and use that as a point of comparison or departure. It was one of the few pronouncements I passed along to my writing style. It was never a lie. But the way I talked about it seemed easy, almost cozy, as if I'd simply knocked at a fireplace, pulled up the rotting floorboards in the kitchen, and basked in the sun of the windows around the table. By deciding to think of myself as a writer, I could say, here I can make something on my own. The complexities of other egos, the perils that come with collaboration. But it hadn't occurred to me that giving up music was as extreme as moving to the Mojave in order to be a better person. I missed the hammering of missed taking satisfaction in their strange reach. I missed the condition of my voice, whether that granular scratch meant strep throat, or whether it was just the season of oak pollen. I missed the sense of inhabiting my body music gave me, locking myself in my butt, neck, thigh, manner of an athlete. I missed trying to impress one by simply singing and playing for them, a practice that somehow took on a life of its own and that my ego dissolved, and we were water. Music was water. I understood it to be so, and that it broke down. It equalized. Once anyone was inside music, there wasn't a boss of it. The listener meant as much as the players. And we weren't ourselves anymore, not quite, with our usual heavy and down hopes. If anything, it made us lighter, buoyant. People give up children. People leave good places behind for their families. People give up their age care for an ailing parent. People leave pleasures behind in order to become activists that help and save others. I gave up the one true thing I had that connected people. I'd been lonely as a child, and I brought myself closer to others through music by playing with and for them. I saved my life. I gave it up. Jude looked right into the camera as if he were looking into my face, even though to do so, he had been looking fully at himself, unafraid. I knew he taught himself lesson in survival for me. And as I listened to his holds and spaces, I heard it as a brand new thing, both up-only and not. His playing wasn't so much about his ability to get it right, to win it, that lay inside what I thought I knew, that was too easy to miss, the song cracking open to a wasn't simply one thing, but an oncoming action, colors, stems, petals, and leaves, both browning and to life at once. See that violet, that yellow, shepherd's needle, fire wheel, bog torch, button bush, chicory, cinnamon. Maybe I'd never really loved. And if I didn't crash into his arms like the speaker, Leah, then I felt them around me, holding me in place. It was staggering to know that about myself after all this time, which only made me want to hold him harder. And now it's just beginning my life. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Now we're going to hear from Jackson. Major is also a former fellow here at Fine Arts, and he currently serves on the writing committee and is vice president of the Falk Board of Trustees. He's a cherished member of the Falk Summer faculty and is teaching a workshop this week called To Imagine Ourselves, a poetry workshop. Major is the author of 5 volumes of poetry, most recently The Absurd Man, a collection of essays, A Beat Beyond, the selected prose of Major Jackson. American Poetry 2019, a recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and National Endowment for the Arts. Jackson published poems and essays in American Poetry Review, The New Yorker, Orion Magazine Review, Ploughshares, and Poetry London. He lives in Nashville, where he is Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Chair in the Humanities at Vanderbilt University. He serves as poetry editor of the Harvard Review. The Rumpus has praised it, and the New York Times compared his work to a remixed Odyssey. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Major Jackson.
Thank you, Rennie and Maddie, and Sarah and David, and our new fearless leader, Sharon Foley. And Paul, that was just absolutely stunning. I just can't. I have the great pleasure of reading the full book, and what a treat to be here again before friends and family members, new and old. As a board member, it's probably my duty to say, hey, this is right, but if you hear something that moved you, like it just free to make a donation, even the smallest amount, as you know, makes a difference. So I'm gonna read new poems, and before I do, I should have thanked someone the other night upon receiving acknowledgement here. And that is my wife, Dee Jackson, who's also a poet. And it makes journeying as a poet quite easy when you have someone journeying. So thank you, Dee, for joining us. I'm going to read mainly new poems. I'm happy to say that I'm on the cusp of a new contract for a select poem called Razzle Dazzle. New and selected, I should say. And I'm going to read some of those. And this is they're all in Roman numerals, so got to remind myself of that education. Over and I bring each to my mouth, the peach of thunder, the peach of bare nights, the peach of starry relation. A singular path of desire along my brain, peach of my enemies, whose slights flicker like poison air, dark as an ink blot, or like honking geese still welcome. Look at my cheekbones, wet and sticky, the juice of living. What arrives as a riddle others' cloudy mornings is merely the conundrum I enter, like a raft going downstream over rough waters. I like going in, even against the odds. I swim in pond. I go to meditate my future between its alabaster columns. No handout. My pulpy tenacity perfumes the air. The peach I sink, teeth solemn as the priest of time. Another Lazarus forsaking his tomb. Urban Renewal 83. The dead are a reservoir of secrets, which they hoard like lions in invisible caves. The dead are disciplined, enclosed rank like catenaries. Occasionally, a night word stream from their occult of mysteries. Avoid all eye contact, yet the light the dead see is all lantern that back the firmament. They sing foot of myrtle trees and read the classics evenings in dentist chairs. They smell like infectant. A wide. If only we could see them in between lanes of traffic, in our hall, inhaling our love cries, envious and roam like forlorn clouds. They avoid graveyards, which make them squirm. The dead have an incurable habit of thieving. The dead want a vacation from the job of being dead. Have to be those kids from their phones. Much apology. This is another new poem, and it was published called "The Language of the Moon." Actually, I'm gonna read this poem because it's home and it's Nashville, Tennessee, and there's a number of singers, but there's also, if many of you industry there, and it caters to bachelorettes, and the bachelorettes are have their they arrive en masse and they wear pink hats, cowboy hats, and mark their tribe. And there's these tractors that pull them along, drink a lot, and dance from street to street. How many have seen this spectacle? Fantastic. This is called Nashville Sonnet, deconstructed on a bed of blossoms. In this city, no one talks dialectical materialism. The cranes speak invisible language. The trusses over pedal taverns and tractors, joyriding flatbed dancing tourists. And it is like reading God's lips. On guard, she says. Today, I am staking light across my wintergreen yard, arm's perspective, to beg his forgiveness. I am reaching fingers into darkest soil, pondering the afterlife. Wren flaps its surefire code to all this achy, breaky singing. Such phrasing like a compass behind a sonneteer's feathered bow. And who doesn't want to live in a city of acoustic martyrs addicted to plus this. Even the magnolias, vulnerable each spring, court a delicious despair and still burst their creamy spark plugs for the living. It's true. Didi and I didn't think it was true, but a lot of songwriters who are serving tables, it's like going and meeting a bunch of Broadway actors. So this is called the French Quarter. I used to live in New Orleans some years ago, and another place that is full of great tourists while the infrastructure struggles. The French Quarter, over powdered beignets, over a demitasse of chicory near Rue de Royale, I came to it. I am the lonely sort. I am ever seeking education, my head sideways, my hand, its words like a concert, the fried dough going cold and congealing, the passing tourist drowned out, a sullen look on my face. It is when I most want to make love. Dostoevsky out of confusion, as I gave the reverence freely. Nothing I believed stayed, and thus my melancholy deepened, though banjos through late afternoon rain, black bottom stomp, eucalyptus, and live oaks aging against our pale. I suffered great pity, and the gypsies were all too quick to auger behind our boxes. Stubborn cats mewed in and out around cafe tables, and pigeons sang from Gothic balconies on the square. If I were one to concessions, my life was a streak of quandaries and doggeries with inexplicable inscriptions on doors, every chapter a tempest or escape hatch at some. I read alone in faint light, a thin band of gold hops at the bottom of a beer mug. It is good for everyone having a good time on the world's piazzas. I am stuck in the questions I have made a home. At least if I were a character in a novel, I would be assured change was around the corner. Perhaps even a priest listened in this crowd, careworn like me, likes driving country roads while thinking gloomy thoughts. Language of the moon. As a child, I wanted as many letters in my bloodstream as the planet Mercury would allow. City, on buses late afternoons, and read all the billboards high above the streets and byways on sides of factories and churches, and never heard the sermons of the placed or the blustery talk of the founding fathers, and saddened when it snaked through long tunnels and then emerged out of the murder of light. I could feel my veins thicken like the of a Powerball, and the mystery of women lounging around a gray-bearded man in a jacket drinking a tumbler of cognac was like the easeful glide of a dream. My mouth puckered whenever lemon-colored arches appeared 5 stories above the city, like golden gates to an unforeseen heaven. I never glanced at other commuters or curators in lucent ties and tuxedos who brown papered bottles and nodded to a stillness murdered in a film. Instead, I glimpsed myself looking out a window, awed by Cartier timepieces and luxury cars that asked, was I hungry for speed, or ordered me to my body drive. I ate advertisements like Seaways line. Though my sense of self was as bruised as a moldy peach, I learned to infrared my longings from the inside and to tally my suspicions from a. When I read a newspaper, I flutter like a sparrow at a bird feeder. And when language spills out of my skull like a massive cruise ship, docked and towering over a line of ramshackle on an island whose blessed pour raised up as though our locker of dollars fell at my brain closes and my veins burst as if pollinating the white face of the moon. This is a poem that I wrote this afternoon, and I'm normally not in the habit of doing that, but I'm writing with my wonderful class this week. And the assignment today was to write about what hinders us, or write about where we would like to go, or do we you if we leave someplace. I think I answer none of the questions. Poems start that way. It's called Giants. The season of fall is upon us, which is the season of capture and strikes, season of calm umpires, and needy fans roaring like a boiling broth of hope and rage, baseball bats like caveman clubs, one a languorous patience for a team in a 12-game losing slump, a mind for days of tawny mittens and gloves and endless synthetic baseballs fouled out of bounds, summer sweat, second skin, or a second skin of charcoal under eyelids like warriors. In fourth grade, I didn't have a taste for the game until my friend showed up on my doorstep with a CYO jersey, youth organization jersey, and an extra glove. Otherwise would have to forfeit a second-round playoff for a lack of 9 players. I was placed in the left field where mosquitoes quietly buzzed around my size cap. I didn't catch a fly ball that 8th inning, but the coach witnessed the fly that I scooped and threw to home and placed me on the mound last inning. It is the season of Gatorade, of curves and slams, of carrying a whole team on your back, except when the ball play, when everyone steps inside the possibility of gallantry, when anyone can be a giant, when a strikeout can muzzle an entire stadium, when a tied game can last into an evening's late innings, exiled from your family and friends and the TV's glow and bubble and your own of screaming and fast balls. Okay, this poem is for the writer Barry Lopez, who we recently passed. Barry had a wonderful book called Of Wolves and Men, which basis of this title called Of Wolves and Imagination. Barry, who, while I was in graduate school years ago in Oregon, Eugene, where he lived, occasioned a few conversations with me that I had driven cross country and camped most of the way to Oregon, which delighted him. And we talked about what I had seen en route. At the time, I didn't see a lot because I had a friend who didn't like camp. We spent most of our money on hotels that getting a 82 Jetta repaired after going through with no air conditioning. Of Wolves and Imagination for Barry Lopez. Every so often, one has to make a sound of terrible pain, low in boundless woods, among thorns, prowling through bramble and tangled vines, whose presence one has to leave one's candlelit dinner at 11 Madison Park with his white linen satin and silverware tenderly laid out like an embarrassment of torture. And one has to gaze into the chambers of a soon empty heart and return to the kingdom up the measured silence of the respectable, whose desire and breaths dangle as though from a string cloth, all squeaky mirth and nothing more. Every so often one has to make a sound like a massive season kept in the pocket, a amulet for when the temperature changes. The imagination is a matinee with a side like this one, accommodating a bed of wild bees, which is the skies burned indigo and your breath can be anything possible, service or the quiet crunch of leaves, earth's golden confetti between palms. Yeah, we'll read that one. This is a poem called, if I can find it. It must be the supermarket in me. Inside, full of wide aisles and thoughtful stocking, where you'll find my feelings and memories. That's why on the outside I look so ordered and pure. My inner supermarket contains an old world butcher shop with no trace of the shoppers arrive with an unfathomable hunger, which I relieve by and value. Some are penniless and can only fantasize, licking their lips at no cheeses and meats behind glass display cases, the cloth-bound breeds and goat at ropes of cured salami. Still they taste. I offer free samples throughout my supermarket so people will come to know and like me. In the produce department, as my peers in avocados for ripeness. In the floral area, some walk off with my bouquets. I contain cheerful who will escort you to your car. At times, truthfully, I dislike this about myself, forever accommodating. I've not always had a supermarket in me. It began when the church in me lost its congregation, and when I lost my mother's love to cocktails and others. There is no place for anger in my supermarket. Keep it in the bathroom with a sign that reads, "No trespassing, employees only." Way of being in the world, a self, full of checkout lines and knocking down my pyramids of canned goods or panic shopping. Empty. And finally, this is called Let Me Begin Again. Let me begin again. Let me begin as a quiet thought in the shape of a shell slowly by a brown child on a beach at dawn, straining to see their future. Again this time, knowing the drumming in my dreams is me inheriting the earth, is morning lighting up the rivers. Burn my vanities, old music in the of scotch, a day moon like a signature of night. This time, let me circle the island of my fears only once, then live like a raging waterfall and grow a magnificent. Ever be the bird cage or the serrated or the empty season. Dear glacier, dear sea of stars, dear leopards disintegrating at the outer limits of our greed. Soon we will encounter you only in motivational tweets. Reader, I should have married you sooner. Time, let me not sleep like the prophet who believes he's seen infinity. Let me run at break speeds towards sceneries of doubt. I have no more dress rehearsals. 10. Look closer. I am licking my lips. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Major. Finally, we're going to hear from photographer and writer Joanne Dugan. Joanne has taught workshops for 24 online writing program and is teaching a workshop this week called Owning Truth, More Experiments in Text and Image for Writers and Photographers. Joanne is a New York City-based visual artist caught as a child. Her work has been exhibited in the U.S., featured in Times T magazine and Review. Her work has been published in 7 text images, including 2 fine art monographs. She's on the faculty of photography and represented at Black Box Projects in London, Prose in New York City, and Copiton in LA. She is often praised for the intricacy and meditation she gives her projects, with Visual Art Source noting that she illuminates to be mined from repetition. London Gallery Weekend described her exhibitions as delightfully evocative, and visually satisfying in its abstracted forms. Please join me in welcoming Joanne Dugan.
People, actual people. Oh, it's so great to be here. And thank you, Major and Paul. Major, it was so nice to talk a couple minutes today, and I love that you're writing along with your students. I think that's so inspiring. And has been my soundtrack my entire life. And I think at the moment, I'm on a stage, so. I also just wanted to thank the Work Center for incredible privilege. It is such a privilege to be here. And it is Sharon and David and Sarah and everybody here who has welcomed me so warmly coming back. I've years. It feels different. It feels better. It feels more alive. And again, just looking at your incredible faces, I'm like, oh my God, I have to take a picture of my audience. Hi. I have to doc. Anyway, it's wonderful. And I am teaching a class in text and image this week. And I've always been fascinated in the joining of text and image. And my work is highly informed by writing. You don't always see it in my final art pieces. Words are behind everything that I do. And I also feel that words are the way in to imagery, and imagery can be the way into words. And so incredible experimental work this week, and I was just the students did this morning particularly, and I think they were too. You are amazing. And so I am a visual artist, and I have a very eclectic career. It's literally been such an inspiration for me to never stop experimenting and trying new things. And it's so I have had a long career with photography, with traditional analog, kind of old school materials, pre-digital materials. I still work in a darkroom. My process is very physical. I went through the whole digital transformations. I love digital photography as well, but my tool is the old way. And I am looking to honor the original processes, but also wanting to in new and unexpected ways. And so this body briefly is about that. For those of you who follow us, I work with silver gelatin printing process as well as process, which happy to answer questions about that later. And I just wanted to show, is it still there? Yes. This, so it's always frustrating to give artist talks because what I do is very dimensional. Just show a flat image on a digital file I find is frustrating, and it doesn't communicate the physicality of the imagery, because my actually in some ways very sculptural, dimensional. And so I have, this is just to give you a sense of it, this is a minute and 20 seconds. This is an exhibit that just opened in London in May, a solo exhibit, and I'm just showing it because I want you to have a sense of what the work actually looks like, as opposed to, and so this is just a walkthrough that someone did of the show. And you see that I mix, the blue works are the cyanotype, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight very briefly, and then the black and white work is silver gelatin, and that is, cyanotype is actually photography's old, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But each image that you see within these abstracted grids are printed by hand, cut by hand, mounted by hand, museum board, so they kind of float in the frame. So they're not just a image. And I worked with traditional kind of representational pictures of people, places, and things. And about 5 years ago, I started to enter my Mingus stage. When I realized that I didn't want to have subjects other than the light that renders the image. And so the light became the subject, and I'll talk about that in a second. And so I'm much inspired now by minimalist painting. I'm totally inspired by painting, but this work is actually done with photographic material. It's hard to explain, so I appreciate, I'm looking for opportunities to speak simply about it. And these are collages that pieced together by hand, and for me, the decision to work abstractly, to be called a photographer and yet work abstractly, was a scary thing to do, and it's just been an amazing journey. So I'm super interested right now in sections, and just, I know I still take pictures of people, places, and things, and one other point that I want to make, and I will show you. Let's see. So this, you saw these sort of buzz by images. I'm going to sort of keep it brief tonight, but this is sort of a more close-up of what you saw buzz by in that video. And these works are actually I'm on slideshow mode, which I'm on a timer. Let's see if anyone can tell me how to adjust the preview so that it gets out of slideshow. I want to do it manually. Anyway, okay. I don't use preview. I use. Thank you. And now it'll be manual. Thank you. Anyway, this work is my daily meditation practice. The piece with various concepts in Buddhist and just general meditation practice. And so each of these images is rendered. I paint them. And I'm going to talk in a second about cyanotype, but I just wanted you to see a couple of them. And I'm going to end by showing you a work in progress book that I cyanotype. So you saw a version of this in the video that I showed. So this, very large piece, and here it's very large, but it's hard to get a sense of it. So this one is 32 by 40. And so each of those strips individually. And I won't get too techie in this talk, answer questions. And so this is kind of what my work is doing right now. And today in class, we talked about the incredible power of repetition within practice, particularly within an artistic practice. And I work in these grid forms. Photography has a long history of referring grids, so I'm referring to photography and painting at the same time. And in you'll see that there's one that's different. So there's a repetition, kind of an imperfect repetition, and then the one that's different is meant to symbolize the Buddhist concept of satori, which essentially means enlightenment that you're working towards, a transformation that happens by doing something over and over again. And these pieces as being visual meditations. And there's also a long history of contemplative art, specifically something called a yantra in tantric practice, which is, a lot of people have heard of mantras, which is a sound that evokes a contemplative state. Mantra is actually a visual diagram. That's so riffing off this idea of yantra. So those are just a few. I just wanted to show you a few pieces because I'm going to concentrate more on my. And so the process that I'm about to show you uses a photographic process called cyanotype, which is considered photography's oldest process. And it was discovered by the British scientist and astronomer Sir John Frederick Herschel in 1842. And it involves painting paper with a chemical mixture of potassium ferrous to dry. Once it dries, it becomes sensitive to UV sun. And I was actually, and so I just wanted to mention the exposure to the sun that causes the blue. And so when you are looking at these blues, you're actually looking at the effects of sun on these materials. And what's fascinating about it, while it's a process, once you mix it and it dries, it's non-toxic. So the chemicals become iron, ultimately. And they're very living pieces, meaning the blues that you see in this work actually change depending on the light of the room. I sort of describe those of us who have heard of mood rings of your body. Cyanotypes actually do that, and they change. They can look kind of bleached out when they're in a sunny room for a long time, and all you have to revive them is put them back into a darker room, and the detail is back. So I love cyanotype. I'm fascinated by it, and I just wanted to show homage. While Herschel took credit for inventing cyanotype, Anna Atkins, within a year of Herschel announcing the cyanotype process, she published the first ever photograph period in 1843. And the fact that it was done by a woman, and the fact, and she was discovered way later, and anyone in cyanotype, and there's a wonderful number of incredible work, knows about Anna. And I think channeling her in Inner Anna, she did botanicals. So often when you see cyanotype, that botanicals, you literally lay, what she did was laid this algae on this sensitive, coated the paper, as I described, laid it down, and then exposed it to the sun, and this blue comes from the sun. And so in my usual way, I never liked it for myself, because I felt that Anna did such an incredible job with it that there was kind of nothing else to say. But I was wrong. And I started working, so I was forced into, in my view, forced into working with cyanotype when I did a residency at the Dune Shacks here in Provincetown in 2019. I was awarded a residency 2 weeks in the Ray Wells Shack with no electricity or running water, and I wanted to make imagery. And I could not bring my darkroom, I couldn't bring my equipment. I had to have a process that was safe, that was non-toxic, and I decided to work with cyanotype, and it completely changed everything for me. That residency changed everything for me. And it really gave me permission to work in this more and more abstract way. So taking the tools of photography and kind of turning them on their head and using them like paint, essentially. So I think I'm a wannabe painter. That's how this happened. And I lugged the water up the 100-yard hill using plastic jugs, and I won't go into all the process, but this is, cyanotypes in process out on the porch. So it was life-changing, and I came back, and those who knew and were part of the story, and a good number of you are here in the room with me, saw the change. And it was so amazing to bring this into my practice. I never expected that I would be working with cyanotype. And so let's see. So I have since started working everywhere that I go, and the amazing cyanotype was so great for the pandemic because it's portable, more or less. So this is me working, and it was like February, so I don't know what I was doing up there, but on the roof of my studio building in New York, and those are painted. So that color is what they look like when you paint them, and it's before the sun has magically energized them and turned them this deep, rich, wonderful blue color. And so that's me in New York. This is me squinting in the sun in Blanchard, Maine, but I just wanted you to sort of see the physical part of this. And so really, photography now, digital photography is so much less physical, right? And I'm always wanting to connect it back to the body, process, environment, highly influenced. And again, the Dune Shack, suddenly I was like, I'm able to render what I'm seeing, seeing in the sky. And that led me to what I'm going to show you next, which is totally work in progress. It's what you're like the first people to ever see it. It's not fully designed yet, so I'm just showing you a loose design of it. And the name of it is Blues. And I just have a little piece of writing here, which is, just first, when I was thinking about how did this happen, and this work happened during lockdown times, pandemic times, and it's like, what was I responding to? Because I didn't think about it first, I just made the work, and I'm still figuring out what I did, but I think that I was really responding to what I consider the saddening of the world, and for so many different reasons that we could go into, particularly over these past 3 years. And also, very directly, lots of depression around me. People that I know, some myself, dealing with a lot of darkness. And so for me, this sort of play on words of the blues, right? It's sort of started to emerge that I wanted to use this process to communicate something. And I realized too that I was doing this process to respond to that saddening and to flip it into hope, into, you know, Paul, you made such a beautiful reference to love today, and I talked about it in my class. I actually named it as a criteria for art making, which is loving. And there's a whole list of things, but loving was the one. And it was really hard to talk about. And I felt a little embarrassed because I'm like, is that cliche? But I don't think it is. You know, I think what we do comes ultimately from love, or lack thereof, or longing, another huge impetus to make work. So, and then additionally, I just wrote, this photographic process connects me to painting. Brushstrokes, paper texture, and chance, renderings emerge that allow me to tap into my unconscious self, to dialogue with a part of myself that doesn't have words. Certain organic forms speak loudly. I let go of thought while I'm painting, and the less I try and control, the more resonant the works become. This process is deeply satisfying for so many reasons. I love the marks of the brush, but I also love that so many things emerge that I have no control over. And the blues vary wildly. I chase different versions of sun and sky to render different tonal ranges, and this elusive and unpredictable process keeps me always wanting to come back to make more. So what you're about to see here is all the process. And so I had those big frames in Wellfleet, Provincetown, New York City, and Monson, Maine. Monson, Maine was a residency that I did, in Blanchard, Maine. And Blanchard, Maine was where the photographer Bernice Abbott lived in the later part of her life. And if you guys don't know her, she's wonderful to know about. I suggest a Google search. And I did a residency there where I was able to work with her actual equipment. And it was also life-changing. So some of these cyanotypes are there. So I'm going to just quickly show you the works in progress, and I guess I'll read. I'm not a big fan of reading what's on the presentation, but I'll do that. And the tiny little bit of text that you're going to see with this work, it's actually referring my interpretation of what was happening in the sky. The painted image was first exposed to sunlight. So it's this process of looking down at the work as it's getting exposed, and then looking up and at what the sky is doing. And what I came to realize, and I haven't been able to technically correlate it, but different places give me different blues and different textures, and it has to do with the sun and the sky and the changes. And I almost don't want to know technically what it's doing, but it's there. And so this project is kind of my way of just noting what I saw and what I felt. Allowing back in what was lifted away. It arrives loudly while I watch. Wellfleet, Massachusetts, which is just say actually, 12:25 p.m. Sunny and about to turn cloudy. Wellfleet, 9:19 a.m. Cloudless but changing. Wellfleet, 10:42 a.m. Almost still to start, then quickly shifting. Blanchard, 3:25 p.m. Moving through and scattering fast. Provincetown, 9:07 a.m. Staying still. Blanchard, 11:16 a.m. everything almost shifted. New York City, 4:27 p.m., complicated, yet still soft. New York City, 11:57 a.m., clouds in the distance, moving in fast. Provincetown, 9:07 a.m., medium to dark, with occasional lightness. New York City, 2:52 p.m., steely and slowly shifting. Blanchard, 9:02 a.m., heavy and dark, with lightness around the edges. Provincetown, 1:03 p.m., sunny, but perhaps about to turn cloudy. Looking again, and then finally seeing stories, beautiful stories. Provincetown, 8:52 a.m., deep color and getting brighter fast. Thank you.
Sit right on there. Look, can we get Major and Paul back on stage with Joanne, and we're gonna do a little Q&A. And we're gonna have this be self-directed, and I'm gonna move the mic. So.
Yes.
And then who has a question? Lots of interesting stuff.
You gotta have one.
So what was what was your algae that you were using to produce the prints? I mean, were you using objects, or was it strictly painting?
Great question. I meant to mention that. I do something called photograms in some of them, but the book that I just showed is pure painting. And then composition. And I'm still surprised by it. Because it's very different than sort of traditional, purely abstract. Great question, thanks.
This is a general question for each of you. Can you talk about the role of support and opposition in creative development? Like, how does support work for you? How does opposition work for you as you choose what to do and as you move forward? And I know it's a very vague question, but I thought.
No, I love oppositions and how oppositions make the tension out of which work is born. Are you talking about that within a piece of writing or in a more external way? Like,
Be interpreted either as from the external world, like my agent hates what I'm doing, or in an internal way, like some of what Joanne was talking about, like being drawn spiritually. Just those forces of things seeming to want you to come to them, and other then pushing away. And I thought it could be interpreted any old way.
yeah, it's a beautiful question. And I mean, I think of my own work as being in conversation or even in argument with the previous book. So for instance, I think like Later is a book that I think at heart believes that maybe relationships are impossible in an era in the wake of the trauma engendered by, generations and years of AIDS. So I wanted to write something that, well, it felt like inevitable to write it for one thing, but it seemed important to write, to claim the possibility of love and faith after that aftermath. Still aware of that aftermath, but so I think I'm going to think about this great question, Marion, but I think that my work over the spectrum of 6 or 7 books now, or I've argued with myself. So the opposition and the support are usually interiorly shaped.
Let's see. I was thinking at several spokes, and one of them being that I think it's important that one places themselves within a tradition, particularly of writing, and within that tradition, still borrow as much as you can, but also to set up an array of areas that you can elbow your way into, and that's what I think about kind of oppositionally. I also thought about the fact that I teach a course, have been teaching it for a while now, on literary movements in America, and the of them are very much kind of generational kind of conflicts, and I was just talking with a friend about how I think it's embedded within our code to, in that Freudian way, to kind of overthrow the previous generation's conceptions of what has been established as norms. And after a while, I realized I should stop teaching that class because my students are probably coming after me at some point. But I think the restlessness that's born out of a healthy regard and a healthy kind of looking back and realizing where one might explore such that they find truly an authentic space where they can inhabit it. And sometimes that does mean being very vocal. A lot of people here who write poetry probably remember the poetry wars. I don't like the tenor of them, but I really appreciate the kind of freedom that came out of them.
That is an amazing question, because as I've been listening, because there's so many different ways to answer it. And I think what came up for me, well, first of all, that there's a quote from Twyla Tharp that's something to the effect of, "No artist is ever pleased. We're just never pleased." And I talk to my students about that, and the whole idea to just accept that. And I think not being pleased, and so I can answer on a personal level, the opposition with myself informs most of what I do. And there's a flow and a moment, and this week we're doing this in the class to really, there's exercises and things that I do to get me in that place of flow, to sort of move on from the opposition. And yet, without the opposition, I can't know the other side. And so I need it. And so it's utterly important to me. And also, from speaking photographically, from purely a visual standpoint, I'm working with opposition within my frames, and I hope you saw that in the work that I just showed. There's this pushing and pulling that's going on within the frame, and possible composition is, in my view, an impossible thing to teach in a linear way, because it's probably why I started working abstractly, because it allows me to feel it. Because I found with photography that subject was getting in the way of that. So I did away with subject. I did it for so long, and now, yeah, it's such an, so thank you for that, and I'm gonna take it with me and think about it some more, so.
I have a question. Is it rude?
No, it's apropos of nothing that was just asked, but really so happy that you're writing about Joni Mitchell, and I'm curious about the daunting task of writing about someone who's so like globally regarded as one of the finest musicians of her generation. I'm curious about whether or not there was that kind of like brain, like, whoa, I gotta like, yeah.
She might be globally regarded. I think that's yeah, I mean, globally regarded, but she is 12 musicians or more in one, and I think I have to keep claiming that over and over. And I also have to claim the audacity of my Joni, and I don't want, as I say that, I don't want to colonize Joni. I want to leave room for the reader to think about their relationship to her. So that's a tricky balance, and yeah, I'm sort of looking forward to that. To that challenge. I feel like weirdly in the last couple of weeks, I shouldn't even say this. There should be wood for me to knock on. I don't feel as scared of the book. I mean, there's a lot to do. But all of a sudden it's hard, but it's fun hard. And I feel some optimism about that. I mean, who knows, as I said to someone else today, what I'll say on Tuesday. So like my question, so I was at the event yesterday with Mark Wunderlich and Idra Novi, a wonderful event, and had come up, and Angie Dufresne was the questioner, and it had come up that these were 3 artists who'd grown up in rural areas, and they were thinking about what it means to make art having grown up in spaces like that. And as I was sitting here tonight, I thought, oh my God, the 3 of us grew up very close to one another in different parts. We all grew up in or outside of Philadelphia. I bet, are there people in this room from the quote-unquote Delaware Valley? Of course. So I'm just like sort of curious. I don't have an answer to this at all, but I'm sort of curious about having, like, how to grow up in that super specific place with super specific cultures shape your work, and does it continue? Like the 3 of us moved away. Even though I like weirdly still work down there and commute a long distance to work down there, but you know, I think if you grow up there, you're always a person of that place. So Major, you grew up in Philadelphia. Joanne's outside of Wilmington, and I grew up in Cherry Hill in New Jersey, outside of Philadelphia. So like 3 different worlds, but super close to one another. I don't know. I don't know.
Sure. Thank you. So, I guess my quick answer is I ran away. My parents still live in the same house that I grew up in, and I still go back, but it's not my place. I'm not nostalgic for it, and yet I go there, and there's. So for me, there were many years that I was taking the train back and forth between Delaware and New York after I had moved to New York because of a relationship, a distanced relationship between Wilmington and New York. And for me, the experience of just watching Philadelphia out of the windows of the train. And so I guess I'm like connecting it to my work. I am making that grids of the windows and the views going by, and I was fascinated by watching it from the outside. But when I was in it, I wanted out. And so in that way, it was a gift because it taught me what I didn't want.
Let's see, Philly gave me so much as an artist. I think I mentioned the other day, my aunt worked at the Film Museum. I was in the second Rocky movie as one of those kids running up the stairs behind the final scene. I wrote the liner notes for the first the Roots album, Do You Want More? I worked in an art center where, I don't know if you remember coming to the Painted Bride Art Center. Yeah, that's right. I'm sure we did. Yeah, then we saw each other at Bread Loaf in Vermont. I owe so much of my life to Philly, and my first book was Identified. I was identified as a Philly poet because it was my material, but then that became very, very fitting. And I decided that I wanted to, as a project early on, push back against narratives of what urban was, because it is a dichotomy that has been politicized for a very, very long time. I mean, you can go back to Wordsworth's poems, and he too is writing about the world is too much with us late and soon, and starts creating these myths and narratives around past places. What complicated it for me was my family was from, oddly enough, where I'm living right now, which is Nashville, Tennessee. So they were Southern folk, like a lot of Black folk, who brought their rituals, brought their foods, who created urban gardens and small little kind of backyards. And you don't hear about that, well, we're starting to talk about it now, thanks to Jacob Lawrence's great series on the migration. People are starting to understand that history of that. But every culture, like I lived on the other side of Girard College, and it was a huge kind of Polish American community there. My grandfather walked me down to South Philly, and there was a great Italian markets there. And it was it was a very segregated city, and thus there was a lot of racial conflict. But there were moments in which there was a lot more understanding and empathy, and I think that's what we need to try and do, much in the same way that we want nuanced stories coming out of rural America. I think we very much need to kind of complicate in our poems and in our work, you know, witnessing something that is a little bit more nuanced than the dangers of the city, you know, which I definitely represented.
I have a question for both. We talked about this in class because my class is a lot about harnessing process and flow and making works quickly and easily without thinking about it too much. And I just wanted to know if you guys have any odd and interesting rituals you do to get you up and running with your process. And I think people really like hearing about that. And I'll share some of mine at the end.
I love that question, Joanne. I don't know if I have rituals so much, but I have to say that for at least 20 years after I got my MFA, I made sure to write at least 5 times a day, and I'm not 5 times a week, excuse me. Not that, don't get excited. Not that. No, I wrote I was very workmanlike, and you know, I think in part that was imbued by my father's own work ethic, and yeah, my father had grown up in poverty and transformed his life through hard work. So I wanted to justify my work as a writer by putting in those hours. And then it occurred to me at a certain point that you can go to the gym every day for an hour or two and do deadlifts and all sorts of curls and not gain any muscle. You can convince yourself you're accomplishing something. And I don't know if there's I don't know if I have a way to connect that to how I write now. But I often try to write. This is really tough now when I often write when I'm not trying to do so. And that's super hard to do. Sometimes that means waiting until a half hour before I teach, because it doesn't have to matter so much if I know that my time frame is limited. I'm always writing, which is another way to say that I'm always thumbing stuff into my phone and looking back on it. So a lot of my writing process is connected to the gathering of scraps and then sitting down with scraps. And a lot of it just happened. I don't like sitting on my butt. I hate it. I love being outside. I don't know, how did I end up in this condition? I love the sun. I love leaves. I love the sound of birds. I want to have a supple body, and I'm tethered to this fucking chair, And so I want to I think it's important to say those things, and then so I want to write. I want to make something that makes a connection to people. So how do I work with those conditions, and how do I write? How do I maintain the play of making something as a kid, So it's hard. It's I have no remedy or solution, but it's a condition that I have to sort of contend with every day.
Like a scratch to itch.
I check in the hotel. I give the front desk all my clothes. I strip down to my underwear and say, here. And I type in my underwear at the computer. No, I don't. Paul's, for me too, after MFA, what was crucial for me was to always then have a group of readers. And ever since I graduated, I've had some readers. Either we meet weekly or every other week. So that's been consistent. And now I have a group. We meet every Monday. Came out of COVID. We meet every Monday from 12 to 2:30. We share words. We don't go off our Zoom screen, but we keep on and mute ourselves, and then come back. And a lot of it is dross. A lot of it is first drafts, but darn it, we did it for the week, and we're all very proud of that. Dee Dee, my wife, is like you, Paul. She cannot be still, and we'll get up. Can I say that? Yeah. And we'll get up and knock on the door and come in and try and create social moments. And I need to be kind of straight in the flow of it. One thing that has been helpful for me, though, and I'll pass the mic, is I've had this long project that when I run out of kind of poems that kind of emerge organically, I go back to this particular project, and that was some of the urban renewal poems. And that sustained me over 25 years. And hopefully they'll be in one single volume. But they have kept me close to language and allowed me to evolve over my life, I can look at that poem and test the subject matter, test the language, and I'm deeply appreciative to have had that project. Yeah.
I have all kinds of, I guess I'm the one that has the really odd things. They're very, I have a lot of physical, repetitive things that I do to prepare myself to make work. And since I'm working visually, but I can also answer as a writer as well. But one of the things that came to mind for me with the question, and I talked about this in class today, is I call it ritual. I work in my little studio in New York, and I have 2 tables, and I have a big table that I do my cutting on, and another table that's where I am when I'm doing my, like, sort of more admin stuff. And if I'm over at the white table for too long, it means I'm surfing the internet and I'm not doing my work. And so having literally the 2 different tables, if my butt is in the chair at the white table, I'm not doing my work. And so I have physical, and it's okay that I'm not doing my work, but I need to have the physical separation between the 2 things. And then the other thing that I do is every night when I leave my studio, I clear the big table. And it's a big table. Even if I'm in a project, most of the time I have flat files that I put the works in progress in, because I need to walk into the room with a blank. It's my blank page. So it's my visual blank page that I create. And so the physicality part of it is just vital for me. And when I went into the Dune Shack, I was always beating myself up. I'm like, you can't sit down, so you can't just sit and do it. Like, why do you keep getting up and moving around? And I always had this voice in my head. And when I was in the Dune Shack, I fell into this rhythm. And all of a sudden I realized I need to get up. It's part of my practice. Partly I'm cutting with knives and things, and I get hunched over. And I just remember when I just gave myself, it's like, that's what I do naturally. The Dune Shack showed me that like I would come in, I would wake up and go in, and I would sweep the shack. Every single day, I swept the shack at the same time. Took all because anybody that's been in those shacks, they're filled with sand. Sweeping the shack was my way of mentally clearing myself, of kind of a meditation, right, to clear. And so my body gets used to that, and my mind gets used to it. So it's very Pavlovian. So when I start sweeping, I know I'm on my way somewhere. And then I just so when I don't sweep, I actually miss sweeping. And sometimes I don't sweep, so anyway.
I think that was a great place.
What's that?
Clearing the space.
Clearing, yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Don't forget that they will be signing books up here at the front table, and the books are for sale at the back. And be sure to come tomorrow for another faculty event featuring Susanna Sonnenberg and Idra Novi. So thank you again. See you again soon.